Okay, guys, so you remember when, way back in, was it Unit 1, where we were solving equations? So if I had, like, x plus 1 equals 3, what would I do here? Subtract 1 from each side, and then I would get for my answer x equals 2, right? And so what we were doing here was we were trying to solve for x. Now we're going to try and solve for x, but it's going to be in problems that have x squared in it. So it's going to be a little bit different. So I don't know, x squared plus 3x plus 2. Okay? So we're going to be solving problems that have x squared in it, but solving for x. So we're going to have to solve by factoring. So now we're taking factoring and we're actually applying it to solving problems. Okay, so there's one property that we need to know before we can do this. It's called the zero product property. Okay, the zero product property says that for every real number A and B, so A and B are just numbers, we don't know what they are right now. If AB equals 0, then either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. Doesn't that make sense?
Wait, can you explain that again?
Okay. If we have two numbers, A and B, and we are multiplying them together, so A times B, and I tell you that when I multiply those numbers together, it equals 0, what does that tell you? That tells you that one of them is 0, right? When I'm multiplying two numbers and it equals 0, at least one of them has to be 0. So that means that either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0.
Oh,
so when I multiply two numbers and the answer is 0, even if I don't know what any of the two numbers are, but I know when I multiply them the answer is 0, don't I know that one of them has to be 0?
Yes.
Okay, that's what the zero product property is saying. Okay? Okay, so this is kind of what it's going to look like. If I have two binomials, x plus 3 times x minus 2, so I'm multiplying two terms, right? And both of them, after I multiply them, we get an answer of 0. What does that tell you? That means that one of my terms has to equal 0. So either x plus 3 equals 0 or x minus 2 equals 0. So this is the same idea of what I just wrote up at the top, but now we're applying it to multiplying binomials. So I have two terms here that I'm multiplying together. The answer is 0. So that means either this one has to be 0 or this one has to be 0. Okay? So first thing we want to do is we want to set the quadratic equation. What is the quadratic equation? A quadratic equation is an equation that has an x squared in it. That's what we call it. Okay, so if there's an x squared, it's called a quadratic. So first step is we set the quadratic equal to 0. Second step, we are going to factor that quadratic completely. So we need to make sure that all the GCF is out. We need to make sure that we did the diamond, or difference of two squares, or bottoms up. Okay? And then we're going to use the zero product property and set each factor equal to 0. And then step 4, for each of those, we're going to solve for x, and we should get 2 answers. Okay, so let's look at an example of this. Okay. So, example 1 gives me x squared plus 5x minus 6 equal to 0. Please, it should be off when you come to school.
It was wrong.
Okay, so our first step was to set the equation equal to 0. Is this guy equal to 0? No. Yes, he is, right? This one's equal to 0, so we're good there. So step 2 is we want to factor completely. What method am I going to use for this to factor? Diamond method. Okay, so I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 6 and add up to 5. What are those two numbers?
Negative 3 and 2. No.
Negative 1. Negative 1.
Negative 5.
Positive 6. Okay.
Oh, I see.
We are multiplying to negative 6, adding to positive 5. So let's factor this thing. So this would give me x minus 1 times x plus 6 equal to 0. So what is this telling me? Okay, this tells me that I have my x minus 1, that's going to end up being some number after we know what x is, and x plus 6 is going to end up being some number after we know what x is. Okay, and when I multiply these two together, I get 0. So what does that mean? That means one of them, good, has to be 0. So what we're going to do, I always draw a line down the middle to keep my work separate. What we're going to do is we're going to set each one equal to 0. So we're going to set this guy, x minus 1, equal to 0. And we're going to set x plus 6 equal to 0. Okay. Okay, our last step, step 4, is to solve for x. So I'm going to work on the green one first. X minus 1 equals 0. How do I solve for x there? I add 1 to both sides. So that gives me x equals positive 1. Now look at the red side. What do I do there? Subtract 6 from both sides. So x equals negative 6. So we actually have two answer possibilities for this one for x. X could equal 1 or negative 6. So we just list the different possibilities for x.
And that's the answer?
And this is my answer. I have two answers. Here is a good tip for you. What is the highest exponent in the original equation? 2. So how many answers did I get? 2. You should always get the same number of answers as the highest exponent. Good question. Is there a way to check it? The answer is yes. How do we usually check answers? We plug it in. So how many since we have two different answers, we're going to have to plug it in twice. So first time, let's plug in 1 for x. I'm going to plug it into my factored form. Is that okay with you guys? Okay, so let's plug in 1 to here. So that would give me 1 minus 1 times 1 plus 6 equals 0. 1 minus 1 is 0. And 1 plus 6? 5. What's 0 times 5? 0. So it checks, right?
Wait, so basically you're not worrying about the...
Alright, so then we have to test negative 6. So how would I test negative 6? Plug that in. So we would get negative 6 minus 1 times negative 6 plus 6, and we want that to equal 0. What's negative 6 minus 1? Negative 7. And negative 6 plus 6? 0. 7 times 0 gives me 0. So is that check? Yeah. So we have to do a check on both numbers, each of them individually. Let's try another one. Example 2. X squared minus 6x plus 8 equals 0. Okay, the first step here is I need to set the whole thing equal to 0. So I need to look here. Is this guy equal to 0? Yeah. So we have the whole equation equal to 0. So then we can go to step 2, which is to factor. What method am I going to use to factor this? Diamond. So let's draw our diamond. I'm going to do it off to the side this time. And I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to 8 and add up to -6.
Wait, can I tell you the answer?
Yeah, what is it?
Okay. It's 4 and -2. No. Yeah, -4.
-4. No.
Negative.
-4, -2. -4 times -2 gives me +8.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so how does this guy factor then? X minus 4 times X minus 2. All of that is equal to 0. So that's telling me that when I multiply this guy by this guy, I'm getting 0. So what do I know about one of these guys?
0.
One of them is 0. So we have to set both equal to 0. So I draw a line down the middle to keep my work separate. And then I'm going to apply the 0 product property, which means I set X minus 4 equal to 0. And I set X minus 2 equal to 0. Let's look at the green one first. X minus 4 equals 0. How do I solve that?
Plus 4.
Add 4 to both sides. So I get X equals
4.
+4. X minus 2 equals 0.
Yes.
Add 2 to both sides. So X equals
X equals 2.
+2. So how would I list my answers?
X plus
X equals
X equals
2 and X equals
4.
4. So we just list them, separate them by a comma. How do I check it? Plug them in. So I have to do 2 checks, right? Okay. First check. X minus 4, so we would get 4 minus 4 times 4 minus 2, and we want that to equal 0. 4 minus 4 is 0. 4 minus 2 gives me 2. And 0 times 2 is 0. So it checks, right? Check number 2. I need to plug in 2. So 2 minus 4 times 2 minus 2 equals 0. 2 minus 4 gives me -2. And 2 minus 2 gives me 0. And what's -2 times 0? 0. So does that check? Yep. So both of those work. So for example 3, I have x squared minus 15x equals 16. First